This little song is about 150 years old. The current version, that became a global hit last year, is almost 110 years old. The song about the red viburnum in the meadow has been around for long enough to serve as an example of something popular in Ukrainian that, on one hand, shows distinctiveness enough from Muscovy and, on the other hand, survive long enough both under Muscovy and alongside Muscovy to make contemporary claims by the latter of language repression to sound a little bit off. With that said, when Muscovy started its war against Ukraine in 2014, one of the official excuses was alleged language repression by Kyiv against poor Russian speakers. Now, for those of us who've been around the block for long enough, this was laughable. During the European Cup of 2012, organized jointly by Ukraine and Poland, matches were played in Kharkiv and Donetsk. For the latter, this was also the last major and peaceful event. According to Muscovy, this was a time of severe repression of the Russian language. Well, let's just say that at that time I had little to no knowledge of Ukrainian, and repressed isn't exactly the word I'd describe my experience in terms of language. As late as 2016, when I was taping these images for this channel, spoken Russian was still the norm even in the capital city, alongside the most confusing element for foreigners, Surzhyk. At that time, there were also claims that one would be beaten in the streets for speaking Russian, but at that time this channel was one of the few in English that even paid attention to this topic, so the talking point didn't go too far. Naturally, with the escalation that started last year, one would expect the use of Ukrainian to increase. And that indeed happened. And once that happened, the Russian claims of language repression increased as well. Now, I don't claim to be an expert, but having gone to Ukraine every single year, at least twice a year except 2020, since at least 2009, I had the privilege of witnessing the transformation of the language space in Ukraine's cities in ways few others did. Certainly, my knack for foreign languages helped quite a bit. Last month, a few friends noticed that I had switched from Russian to Surzhyk and to Ukrainian without even realizing, though I still count my knowledge of Ukrainian language as very low. So, armed with this background, I put a cap that visibly said Romania on it and spoke mostly Russian for a month in Ukraine during wartime. From east to west, including Lviv, a place which Russian propaganda spends a lot of time demonizing. I also had two colleagues with me who only spoke English. So how did it go? How repressed were we? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, this will be quite short. In fact, if I drop all the nuances, the clip could be just this. No, nobody beat me up in the streets for speaking Russian. But, with that said, I did notice some changes that I didn't expect. For starters, here's me playing a societal game in Lviv. It's called Poke Holes in the Moscow. The chaps organizing it were describing it as follows: it's no biggie if you miss, but it's quite unfortunate if you don't shoot. The funniest thing is that the game was explained to me in Russian. According to Vatniks in my neighborhood, Ukrainians in general and Lviv in particular hate Romanians and beat the crap out of Russian speakers. The reaction by the chap when he learned we're from Romania was a remark in Italian followed by a Slava Nazi. I politely replied, Smiert Voroham, and then continued to poke holes in the Moscow. Now, this Italian thing was going to repeat itself a few more times. One chap in a mall had terrible English and refused to speak Russian, but also wanted to help, so he provided directions to us in Italian when he heard we're from Romania. In the far western part of the country, I have, over time, met quite a few people who didn't want or didn't know how to speak in Russian, even after learning I wasn't Russian myself, so instead they tried English, German, French, even Hungarian or Romanian, but Italian? That's new, even by my experience. So I started sending emails to academics and other well-traveled people who are accustomed to this country, and turns out the answer to this sudden appearance of Italian isn't quite so weird. For starters, I have been asked in Ukraine in the past, as early as 2014 or 15, about how it is that Romanians learn Italian so fast while Ukrainians who go to work there struggle tremendously with the language. And every time I would calmly explain why. But generally, just like most of my fellow countrymen learned that they have a neighbor in the north starting with February of 2022, the reverse is true as well. Many Ukrainians learn that they have a neighbor to their southwest as well. And inevitably, some of them had previous exposure to Italian, so noticing the similarities between Romanian and Italian was unavoidable. And inevitably, they told others about it too. 15 months later, after 4 million Ukrainians have either transited through or lived for a longer or shorter period of time in Romania, the connection stuck in pop culture. So now Romanians are basically the neighbors with the Italian-sounding language. I don't even know if I should be upset by it. But I do know why it's stuck. It comes down to a phenomenon that is widely present in Ukraine that nobody even notices. Remember when I mentioned switching from Russian to Surzhyk and to Ukrainian as a matter of routine? Well, that continues to be very common to this day and has been the norm, at least in post-communism. The reason this phenomenon occurs is because of a characteristic of Ukrainian and Russian languages, a characteristic that also exists between Italian and Romanian. It's called asymmetrical intelligibility. Now, people are more familiar with the notion of mutual intelligibility, which means each person easily understands the other person's language even if they speak different languages. This is the case with Dutch and Afrikaans, Czech and Slovak, or Azerbaijani and Turkish. However, these cases are rarer than people think, even in the case of languages that were once part of the same country. A lot more common is the phenomenon of asymmetrical intelligibility, in which one person understands the other person's language quite well, but the reverse is not happening to the same degree. This is the case with Ukrainian and Russian, but also with Romanian and Italian. Without significant exposure, a Ukrainian speaker will understand Russian to a much higher degree than a Russian speaker will understand Ukrainian, hence asymmetrical intelligibility. Now, why am I spending so much time explaining this technicality? Well, because when tankies and vatniks claim things on the internet or on TV about the topic of language space in Ukraine, they rely on the audience not being aware of these nuances. Also, in time, the Kremlin has also pushed two extreme narratives on this topic. The narrative that Ukrainian and Russian are very similar, and it is thus a pity and rude for Ukrainians to keep insisting on it, and the narrative that the two are so different that insisting on removing Russian amounts to repression. Now, both are wrong. Of course, there is a degree of similarity, almost two-thirds lexical similarity between Ukrainian and Russian. It just so happens, though, that Ukrainian has even higher lexical similarity with Polish and the highest similarity with Belarusian, which is another language thoroughly repressed by Muscovy and Muscovy-aligned Lukashenko regime. And this point about similarity with Belarusian and the repression of Belarusian language is not some academic or theoretical point. It is in fact a recurring concern of Russian talking heads. Here's a clip from last month from Russian TV.
Мои знакомые, я вот сейчас только что вернулся из Беларуси, из Бреста, они говорят: слушайте, у нас молодежь откуда-то взяло, что они не белорусы. Говорит, мой сын приходит, говорит, а я литвин. Это вот в 16-17-летие. Откуда это? Они слушают польское радио. Вот, на белорусском языке, на белорусской мове начинают учить белорусский язык. Если раньше в Минске, в Бресте, фактически никто не говорил по-белорусски, сейчас начинают специально учить белорусский язык. Это опасно, это реально опасно.
Мы все прекрасно знаем, что без Беларуси, без выравнивания этого фронта от Черного до Балтийского моря, они не видят себе будущее Европы, не видят себе будущее конфронтации с Россией. Для них оторвать Беларусь от России – это ключевая задача.
стратегическая, она им
Да.
очень важна. И они делают ставку на молодежь, вот эти вот...
Как везде и всегда.
Да, настроение, то, что они литвины, это не просто так. Действительно, посмотри в твоей родной Украине. Ведь многие же были просто русскоязычные и не знали украинский язык. Прекрасно, что они сейчас знают. Вроде бы.
Я знаю
Да,
массу
но это было
русскоязычных
все
садистов
стратегией,
националистических.
которые не знают
отрыва
украинского.
от России.
По-прежнему.
Да. Это элемент
Азовцы,
отрыва, да.
азовцы
С языка
формировались
снял.
из кого, да?
У них радиопереговоры были
Конечно.
на русском
Откровенно
Они даже
языке.
садисты,
украинского
но при
не
этом
знали.
русскоязычные.
Нет, там были те, кто знает, но там было много тех, кто не знает.
Польские и литовские спецслужбы именно навязывают изучение этого языка, чтобы оторвать молодежь от России. Один из моих знакомых много лет принимал участие в Брестской крепости во время реконструкции. 22 июня они собирались, надевали старую форму, в 4 часа имитировали нападение немцев. Вот мой знакомый из Минска. Он одевал красноармейскую форму, в общем-то, погибал там каждый год 22 июня. Сейчас он начал изучать белорусский язык, он начал говорить о том, что Тихановская, мой президент, человек взрослый, вот нашего с тобой возраста. Откуда это берется? Для меня это загадка.
Notice how Russia's vision is somehow attributed to the West? But the parallel world of Russian television talk shows notwithstanding, this little clip does provide a small peek into the mindset of a lot of Russians. In practice, before Muscovy went crazy again, the issue of asymmetrical intelligibility in Ukraine and Belarus was dealt with the imperialistic way. Everyone learns Russian and adopts it as a lingua franca of communication between ethnic groups. This way of doing things remained the standard many years after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and it still is the standard in some former Soviet republics such as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, or Armenia. And it would have probably remained the standard in Ukraine if not for the whole war thing, which again has been lasting for 9 years already. But even under this context, things changed gradually rather than suddenly, and less harshly than what Muscovy would have you believe. There's even some numbers on it. So, according to a survey conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology last December, there is an increase of usage of Ukrainian compared to the results of a similar study conducted in 2017. 41% of respondents say that they use Ukrainian in everyday life, 17% in most situations, and only 6% speak Russians exclusively. At the same time, 24% of Ukrainians reported that they use both languages equally. This is indeed higher than in 2017, when only 34% used Ukrainian in everyday life, but the proportion of those using both equally remains unchanged. Also, the reason for the change is not exactly unified either. When asked why they choose to speak Ukrainian, a whopping 76% said it's because it's the official language and thus you encounter it every day whether you like it or not. A lot fewer respondents, a minority, gave more romantic reasons. But, surveys aside, those who are familiar with this country have kept on noting over the last year that the vast majority of the areas affected by Russia's escalation are in fact areas of Ukraine where the Russian language was, and oftentimes still is, the norm. In other words, Muscovy is protecting the Russian speakers by flattening their cities and turning those said Russian speakers into internally displaced persons or refugees. And that alone should tell you how much of this madness is about the language. In Bucha and Irpin, as we were walking up and down the streets, we were approached exclusively in Russian. Imagine that. These people have been shot at randomly on the streets by the Russian military, and even so, not only we got no negative reaction for being a bunch of foreigners using the Russian language, but even without opening our mouths, we were approached in Russian under the old way of doing things. And this is because of an aspect that, of course, these days is less discussed, namely that even now, with all of the messed up things that are happening, significant portions of the populace continues to avoid associating the Russian language with Russia itself. And while this may be controversial to some, this is also the correct attitude to have. The reason this video is in English is not for some insatiable love of mine for England. In fact, I would consider it a form of torture to have to live in England. And the reason I learned Russian wasn't because of some insatiable love for Russia either. The reason people learn languages is for their usefulness. That's why deeply anti-American Serbs speak American English. They haven't changed their mind on the United States or on the geopolitics, but saw the usefulness of the language. And some form of the same phenomenon is happening in Ukraine too. Despite what Russian shills say and will continue to say, the use of Russian language in public will decline a bit more in Ukraine, but it will stabilize to a relatively high degree and will continue to be around as a useful tool for many years to come. Which is why I support the intellectual initiative of just stopping from calling it the Russian language. I don't know, let's find a nicer name for it, but dropping its use altogether will not be feasible anytime soon. What has changed quite dramatically in the language space, a lot more than the speaking in public part, is the way residents of Ukraine speak and write on the internet. While 10 years ago nearly half of the population was using both Russian and Ukrainian equally, with further 30% using mostly or exclusively Russian, today things have changed quite significantly. Not only the proportion of Russian was reduced to just 6%, with further 38% using both, but a new category emerged: English. This, in my view, is the biggest change. For the first time in the last 15 years, it is also noticeable on the streets, with random people wanting to practice their English with foreigners. That didn't used to happen. Of course, there are trade-offs with that too. Neither advocates of Russian nor the advocates of English are willing to admit, but the process of bringing in a new language does come with civilizational aspects and/or reflexes of the culture that produced that language. It's not an inevitability, though, as the example of Poland can show, and it is not by accident that I give Poland as an example, because Poland serves as an inspiration here as to how the country should function after the war. Whether that's reasonable or not, of course, remains to be determined. But the appearance of English as a preferred second language of use should lower the tensions quite a bit. What tensions? Well, situations like the one where I got replies in Italian. Now, it just so happens that I do understand Italian, but what if I hadn't? I mean, fine, you don't want to use Russian, but give me something to work with. Ukrainian is a difficult language, and while I made some progress with it because I'm a weirdo with languages and because I come here often, most others will not bother. And once this war is over, whether it's in 6 months or 6 years, it doesn't matter, at some point it will be over, and once that happens, investment will start pouring in. And being able to work with those investors will be quite important, and no, expecting them to learn Ukrainian is just not going to happen. Raising the level of English proficiency and exposure in the general public will definitely prevent new tensions from this perspective, though it would still mean that one would have to be proficient in both English and Russian in order to navigate the country. Fine by me, but we'll see how it plays out. It will sure be interesting for polyglots, but a source of annoyance for others. Что делать? Ничего делать. So, to sum up, were we repressed in Ukraine for using muskalish? No, of course not. Almost nobody cared, and when someone did care, we still found a way. You know, like normal people have been doing with travelers since forever. Funny story. I took my colleagues to this museum in Kyiv, and the guide was an older woman, and she was explaining things, and at some point she used the Ukrainian phrase I didn't understand and couldn't translate to my colleagues. So I told her that Muskalski or English would be better. She laughed, apologized for not being proficient in English, and Muskalski it was. So yeah, maybe we should call it Muskalski. Provides a good laugh and smoothens the interaction. Ultimately, Muscovy will continue to shout that Russian is being repressed. Propaganda like this one, trying to make language political, will continue to be posted, especially in the western part of the country, where use of Russian language has always been low, and the Western media will continue to highlight the few cases where a few people who never knew Ukrainian are now trying to get up to speed. But in the end, practicality will win out. It has to, because the alternative is much worse and not desired by anyone with the exception of the Kremlin. Fortunately, Ukrainians are largely reasonable peoples that are successfully ignoring the noise around the topic. Like, for real, this topic is far more hotly contested outside of Ukraine, and that's probably a good thing. So yeah, that's all I had to say about this topic for now. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and if you like what we do, consider giving a hryvnia. And with that, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.